Once upon a time, if you wanted to build the safest, strongest, most perfect airplane in the sky, you went to a place called Boeing. For nearly 80 years, Boeing wasn't just a company, it was a temple of engineering. It was run by people who obsessed over the tiny details. They spent sleepless nights worrying about the strength of a single bolt or the thickness of a wire. At Boeing, if an accountant told an engineer to save money by using a cheaper part, the engineer would laugh him out of the room. The rule was simple: if it isn't perfect, it doesn't fly. Imagine a toy company that makes the world's best wooden trains. Every train is carved by hand. Every wheel is polished until it shines. The people who run the company are master woodworkers. They don't care if a train takes a week to make. They only care that it lasts for 100 years. That was Boeing. They built the planes that carried presidents. They were the kings of the sky because they prioritized physics over everything else. But then, something changed. The master woodworkers were replaced by people who didn't know how to carve wood. They only knew how to read spreadsheets. They looked at those perfect wooden trains and didn't see a masterpiece. They saw a waste of money. They thought, why use expensive screws when we can use cheap glue? The train looks the same, doesn't it? This is the story of how Wall Street moved into the cockpit of the world's greatest aviation company and accidentally flew it into the ground. The turning point happened in 1997. Boeing bought a smaller, struggling airplane company called McDonnell Douglas. On paper, it looked like Boeing was the winner. They were the big brother taking over the little brother. But in reality, something very strange happened. It was a reverse takeover. The leaders of the smaller, struggling company were the ones who ended up running the show at Boeing. It was as if a five-star restaurant merged with a fast food joint, and suddenly, the guy who runs the deep fryer is telling the world-class chef how to cook a steak. The new bosses didn't come from the factory floor. They came from Wall Street. Their hero wasn't the engineer who designed a better wing. It was the stock price. The new CEO famously said that Boeing was no longer an engineering shop. He said they were a business. To an engineer, that sounded like a death threat. In a business, you cut costs. In engineering, you build the best thing possible. To make sure the engineers didn't interfere with the new plan to make the stock price go up, the bosses did something radical. They moved the company headquarters from Seattle, where the planes were built, all the way to Chicago. They literally moved the bosses thousands of miles away from the people who actually knew how to build airplanes. They didn't want to hear about safety problems. They wanted to hear about profit margins. With the bosses now sitting in high-rise offices in Chicago, far away from the smell of jet fuel, they decided to build a brand new plane called the 787 Dreamliner. But instead of building it themselves like they used to, they had a brilliant new business idea. They would outsource everything. Imagine you want to build a giant Lego castle. Usually you buy the bricks and build it yourself so you know every piece fits perfectly. But Boeing's new bosses decided to hire 50 different neighbors to build 50 different sections of the castle. One neighbor builds the tower, another builds the drawbridge, and another builds the dungeon. Boeing's job was just to snap the big pieces together at the end. They thought this would save billions of dollars because they wouldn't have to pay for all those expensive factories and workers. But here is the catch. When the pieces started arriving in Seattle, they didn't fit. The neighbors used different types of plastic. Some pieces were too big while others were too small. The sections were a mess. Instead of saving money, the Dreamliner became a multi-billion-dollar disaster. It was years late and way over budget. Boeing had lost its engineering soul. They had forgotten how to build things because they were too busy trying to manage contracts. But instead of learning their lesson and going back to their roots, they doubled down. They were about to make a mistake that would cost hundreds of lives. While Boeing was struggling with the Dreamliner, their biggest rival, a European company called Airbus, released a new plane that was much more fuel efficient. Airlines all over the world started canceling their Boeing orders to buy the Airbus instead. Boeing panicked. They needed a new plane, and they needed it right now. But building a new plane from scratch takes 10 years and billions of dollars. Boeing's bosses didn't want to wait that long. It would make the stock price drop. So they decided to take a shortcut. They took an old plane from the 1960s, the 737, and decided to just slap some new engines on it. They called it the 737 MX. There was just one problem. The new engines were much bigger than the old ones. They didn't fit under the wings. To make them fit, Boeing had to move the engines higher and further forward. This changed the physics of the plane. It made the plane want to tilt its nose up toward the sky during takeoff. If a plane tilts up too much, it falls out of the air. To fix this tilting problem, the engineers created a secret software program called MCAS. This software would automatically push the nose of the plane down if it felt the plane was tilting too high. Boeing was so desperate to save time and money that they didn't even tell the pilots the software existed. They didn't want the pilots to have to spend weeks in expensive flight simulators learning a new system. They wanted to be able to tell the airlines that it was the same old plane and that the pilots didn't need any new training. The shortcut worked. The 737 MAX sold faster than any plane in history. The stock price skyrocketed. The bosses were heroes on Wall Street. They were making so much money that they decided to do something that seems insane in hindsight. Instead of spending their billions of dollars on better safety or new technology, they spent $43 billion on stock buybacks. In simple terms, they used the company's cash to buy their own stock just to make the price go even higher. It was like a farmer selling his tractor to buy a fancy suit, so he looks rich at a party. The tractor is what makes the farm work, but the suit now makes the neighbors jealous. Boeing was eating its own future to keep the investors happy today. Then the unthinkable happened. In 2018 and 2019, two brand new 737 MAX planes crashed. 346 people died. The secret software had malfunctioned, and the pilots, who didn't even know the software existed, couldn't fight back against the machine. The world was horrified. The planes were grounded. Boeing's reputation, built over 80 years, vanished in an instant. The ghost of McDonnell Douglas, the culture of profit over safety, had finally claimed its victims. But even after this, the company struggled to change. The accountants were still in charge, and the engineers were still being ignored. You would think that after two crashes and billions of dollars in fines, Boeing would have cleaned up its act. They promised they would go back to being an engineering-first company. But culture is a hard thing to fix once you've spent 20 years breaking it. In early 2024, a brand new Boeing plane was flying at 16,000 feet when a piece of the wall simply blew out. Passengers looked out into the open sky. It was a miracle. Nobody died. When investigators looked at the plane, they found something embarrassing. 4 critical bolts were missing. They weren't broken. They were never put in. The factory workers were being pushed so hard to meet deadlines and make the numbers look good for Wall Street that they were literally forgetting to bolt the planes together. The reality is that Boeing has become too big to fail. Because they are one of only 2 companies in the world that build big planes, and because they are a massive part of the economy, the government can't let them go bankrupt. This creates a zombie company. They are too broken to fly correctly, but too important to die. The engineers are trying to fix the wooden trains, but the glue of Wall Street is everywhere. The story of Boeing is a warning for every business on the planet. When you stop obsessing over the product and start obsessing over the price tag, you might make a lot of money for a little while, but eventually, the laws of physics catch up with the laws of finance. You can't account your way out of a broken wing. In the end, the only thing that actually makes a company valuable is the quality of the things it builds. Boeing forgot that they were in the business of flight, and they started thinking they were in the business of finance. And as the world learned the hard way, finance doesn't have wings. So, the next time you see a company's stock price going up while their customers are complaining about quality, remember the ghost of Boeing. Remember the master woodworkers who were replaced by guys with calculators. Profit isn't something you create by cutting corners. Profit is the reward you get for building something perfect. Boeing used to be the gold standard of the world. Now they are a lesson in what happens when you let the bean counters take the wheel. The sky is a very unforgiving place for people who try to save money on bolts. And for Boeing, the long flight back to being a temple of engineering has only just begun. It takes a second to lose your soul, but it takes a lifetime to earn it back. Finance is a game of numbers. Aviation is a game of lives. And on Wall Street, they sometimes forget the difference. But the wind, the gravity, and the missing bolts, they never forget.